Good afternoon, good early evening, if I may put it that way. We are in the last but one meeting of the day. It is the last but one meeting after 2 days of very vivid and thought-provoking debates, and I can't thank you enough for attending our this meeting. It is my name is Doru Costea. I am an expert associate with the New Strategy Center, and I'm a retired ambassador. And it is a great honor, of course, to moderate a conversation on a topic which is very challenging in both intellectual and practical ways. We have invited a group of outstanding personalities with a treasure of experience in both these two dimensions, intellectually and operationally, so to speak. Their experience is deeply rooted in their thinking about and doing things, and they were directly connected with various components of international security. It is suffice to mention very briefly who they are, and of course you are familiar with their the details of their resumes, either because we had already met them several times ago, or because you visited the website or looked at the handbook you have been given. We have Ambassador Elena Poptodorova from Bulgaria, who was twice ambassador of her country to the US. Ambassador Teodor Meleșcanu, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania and Minister of Defense. And also he headed the Service of Foreign International Intelligence. Professor Christopher Coker, the Director of IDEAS. IDEAS is a very suitable name for the think tank of the London School of Economics. Mr. George Friedman, I think no need to highlight who George Friedman is. Professor Charles Powell, Director of Elcano Royal Institute, and of course Professor Ullman, Harlan Ullman, who is, has graced us with the book just the other day. A warm welcome to you all, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for accepting our invitation. Our guests will introduce their topics for around 10 minutes each. After that, we'll have a Q&A session in the second part. Now, let me just give you a very short introduction of our topic. The title of our panel is open to an analysis in itself. The post-pandemic world. It seems that this world is on the verge of turning into a world doomed to become familiar with the pandemic. What post-pandemic? Pandemic has not passed. Pandemic is here. The fourth wave is around us. Shall there be a fifth wave? And so on and so forth. A bitter remark in the social media reads, and I quote, "What does not kill you mutates and tries again." The international insecurity, this sentence, to my mind, might very well do without the brackets. So, international insecurity. Because transitions are naturally accompanied by feelings of lack of security. The overwhelming message when addressing international developments is about moving from a global reality that we have become acquainted with somehow to another reality which is more volatile and less predictable, Moreover, and perhaps more importantly, this emerging reality is defined by a disquieting mix of old concepts and new tools. Under these circumstances, questions abound, and even a short inventory would take a long time to read. Consequently, our debate will perhaps deal with issues like the future of international order under the impact of security challenges, both old and new. The fate of multilateralism, which some consider unavoidable, while others see it merely useful, unless unilateralism is deemed necessary. The relationship between regional and global trends, which is sometimes confusing, sometimes even mandatory, even implying an either-or choice. And of course, many other topics. Now, I stop here, and I like to open the conversation by inviting Professor Powell to take the floor. Sir.
Ambassador, thank you so much for your kind words and your very thoughtful words, including some guidelines that you... Okay. Thank you for those introductory remarks and those some very thoughtful words that you sent us by email by way of inspiration. My name is Charles Powell. I'm the director of the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid, and I'm really honored and grateful to have been invited to this event today. The ambassador very rightly questioned the title itself. Is this a post-pandemic world? And are we now finally moving into a post-Cold War international order? As a historian, I'm fascinated by the difficulties that we're encountering in trying to deal with the long-term consequences of the pandemic. And of course, historians have to use the past in order to shed light on the present and hopefully the future. And of course, if you think about the Spanish flu, which by the way wasn't Spanish at all, which in itself is quite interesting. This is a very early example of disinformation and fake news. You probably know that the reason why it's called the Spanish flu is because Spain did not take part in World War I. And in other countries, news about the flu was censored by national authorities. But this news was not censored by Spain, by Spanish authorities. And as a result of that, people elsewhere came to the erroneous assumption that the origin of the pandemic was in fact Spain, which wasn't the case. We don't actually know what the origin, what the geographic origin of the Spanish flu was. But let me remind you, this infected a third of the world's population and resulted in as many as between 25 and 50 million deaths. I'm not underestimating the importance of the current pandemic, but according to official figures, 4.5 million people have died, although some people estimate that this figure may be as high as 15 million. And I'm certainly not underestimating the impact of the disruption caused by the pandemic. 114 million jobs were lost worldwide as a result of COVID-19. And next year, 2022, the global unemployment figure will exceed 20 million people as a result of the pandemic. But the point I really want to make, and this is sometimes lost on us, is that yes, this was a global pandemic, but the impact was distinctly asymmetrical. And just to give you one figure which is stuck in my mind, Latin America represents 7% of the world population, but also represents 30% of the people who have died as a result of COVID. So what are the consequences, some of the consequences of the pandemic and the possible impact of the pandemic on the international order? I think the general consensus among academics and think tankers is that the pandemic is not so much a game changer as something that has accelerated and intensified trends that were already in evidence. And if you agree with this general premise, I think you will agree with me that first of all, it has highlighted some unexpected and probably unwanted consequences of globalization. By the way, there is a very interesting debate about whether globalization has been arrested as a result. Some academics are arguing that, in fact, there has been a partial deglobalization in some areas, but a partial reglobalization in other areas. Think of online education, for example, at an international level. And in any case, the decoupling of the American and the Chinese economies that's clearly now happening makes it rather difficult to measure whether globalization, at least economic globalization, is in fact decreasing or not. The second point is that the pandemic has highlighted the importance of multilateral organizations, undoubtedly, but also the fact that they are woefully inadequate to deal with this kind of crisis. Thirdly, we have come to realize, probably for the first time everywhere in the world, that health is the most important global public good. And it has also probably helped us to understand the relationship between health, the environment, the health-environment development nexus, which we had perhaps lost sight of. Incidentally, very few people are mentioning this, but we now need to revise the UN's global development goals, because in fact, the world has been blown off course by the pandemic. Now, given all of this, what I find truly shocking and really quite surprising is how little has been done to revitalize or to strengthen the institutions of global governance that we already had. The World Health Organization remains, again, chronically underfunded, although in this case it is true that America is back. America is back in the WHO. And similarly, the G7 and the G20 have played an almost negligible role in dealing with the crisis. I think it's also very noteworthy that the pandemic has not fundamentally modified international relations or the existing world pecking order. The United States remains the dominant power. Let me remind you that in terms of GDP per capita, the US is still 6 or 7 times richer than China. The gap is narrowing, but it will remain there for a long time to come. The world is still essentially dominated by growing China-US rivalry, and this we now understand is a systemic phenomenon. It's structural and therefore long-lasting. I think we also begin to understand that it's much more complex than the rivalry that existed between the US and the USSR during the Cold War, essentially because it's not about nuclear weapons or spheres of influence or even ideology. It's essentially now about trade and technology, and this, of course, affects society as a whole. And above all, this rivalry is now taking place in a much more interconnected world than the world we had in the 1960s or 70s. If anything, then, the pandemic has perhaps slightly accelerated the bipolarization of the world order, so that is perhaps its most significant impact. And now I'm basically going to talk about Europe and where Europe fits into this picture. From my point of view, Europe, which I will use synonymously with European Union, although that's a mistake, of course, to some extent, Europe's biggest challenge today is to maintain a one world structure. What do I mean by this? I mean one international order to which all states can contribute because they basically subscribe to its core set of rules, not necessarily values, but rules. And ideally, a concert of great powers embedded in strong multilateral institutions should and could play a leading role in this order. The alternative is quite frightening. The alternative is a world which will become increasingly fragmented as great powers decouple and try to form their own mutually exclusive blocks of influence. And as I was saying or implying earlier, this context is more complicated than the one we had in the Cold War because power is much more widely distributed. Power is more diffuse than it was under the Cold War. And this could therefore make international collaboration in areas such as the struggle against climate change extremely difficult indeed. From a European perspective, the US-China rivalry is very bad news. I think it's bad news for the US and it's bad news for China, but it's very bad news for the European Union as well. essentially because the European Union, because of its very nature, benefits enormously from the existence of an open, rules-based international order. So the EU, I think, now is gripped by two main concerns, two main fears related to this growing Sino-US rivalry. The first is the possible fragmentation or the greater fragmentation of the world order, and the second is an increased securitization of international relations. And the EU is very badly equipped to deal with either of those things, essentially because if it's a power, it is still a civilian power. The EU has been trying to adapt to this, as we know. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has described her commission as geopolitical, and Josep Borrell, the HRVP, wants the EU to learn how to speak the language of power. And of course, neither of these things come very easily to the EU, as we all know. Nevertheless, I think the EU has made some progress. For example, in 2019, before the pandemic burst, the Commission defined China in a rather sophisticated document as a partner, as a competitor, and also as a systemic rival, which I think is actually quite realistic and accurate. And indeed, China is all three. The EU needs China if it wants to tackle things like climate change, if it wants to deal with weapons of mass destruction, and if it wants to maintain levels of trade and investment at their current status. Now, my main concern here, and what I really want to stress, is that this growing US-China rivalry is sucking the oxygen out of the multilateral order which the European Union needs in order to thrive, and perhaps even in order to simply survive. Now, let me be clear. I am not advocating that the EU should be equidistant between China and the US. It's clear to all of us, especially at a gathering such as this, that the EU is much closer to the US in terms of its fundamental values and interests. But let's not be mealy-mouthed about this. The Trump administration has really given us a shock. It was a major wake-up call. Here, for the first time in the history of European integration, we had a US president who actively promoted Brexit, in other words, something which would undermine the fundamental unity of the EU, and who compared the EU to the former Soviet Union. In other words, for the first time since the Rome Treaties in 1957, there was someone in the White House who was an open and declared enemy of European integration, and this had never happened before. So how will the EU's position evolve? I predict 4 possible scenarios. The first is the almost complete alignment of EU member states with the United States. This perhaps might have been easier pre-Afghanistan debacle, but Afghanistan doesn't really modify this. However, there are, as you know, EU member states who will not agree to this. The second scenario is a significant EU alignment with China. This is the most unlikely of the 4 scenarios I'm describing. The third is very possible, the division and fragmentation within the EU, which will render it irrelevant as a global actor. This, of course, is not one that I would like to see. And finally, our preferred outcome is the one that we are now generally referring to as strategic autonomy. Now, strategic autonomy, as we've already seen during the last 2 days, is a very ambivalent, ambiguous term, and this is neither the time nor the place to explore it in full. But the point I want to make is that the pandemic has made us realize that strategic autonomy goes way beyond the defense and security arena. The pandemic has shown us that the EU needs greater medical, pharmaceutical self-sufficiency. In other words, the EU requires industrial and technological autonomy. Without it, by the way, it will be impossible to meet the demands that we are imposing on ourselves in adopting the green and digital transition, which is at the heart of our economic recovery plans. So ultimately, autonomy means essentially the independence to make our own decisions and the capacity to implement them. Now, sadly, of course, as we all know, particularly in the defense field, these 2 things are often missing. So to conclude, the post-pandemic world is in some ways familiar, in some ways an uncertain one. We are still in a multipolar world with weak multilateral institutions. Power, as I have stressed, is more widely distributed and disseminated than it was during the Cold War or even during the post-Cold War period. And this, of course, makes the world order more unpredictable and unstable and potentially dangerous than ever. In this context, the European Union, which does not dream of domination and harbors no expansionist plans, as you all know, should aspire to become a decisive and constructive pole of its own in this future multipolar world. Now, ultimately, what I'm really saying is that we should cease to ask what America can do for us, and instead we should ask, first of all, how can we, Europeans, become a credible global actor? And secondly, what can we, the EU, do to prevent this fragmentation of the international system and strengthen the multilateral order? Sadly, I do not have easy answers for those two questions, but maybe if you'll invite me back next year, I can think of something. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Thank you very much, Professor. I think we just heard a brilliant example of how an answer to a general topic triggers N+1 other questions that are very easy, just like Professor Powell has said, to answer. We only need 1 year to prepare for one answer at least. And since there were at least 4 scenarios, we have a whole 5-year plan in front of us. Now, we move on to Professor Harlan. Sir, we have watched in shock and awe how a hedgehog turned into the 5th horseman. So, can you share with us some things about that?
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your comments. And you're right, the pandemic is not going to leave us. Let me summarize my comments in very simple terms. I do not have the foggiest idea what the world looks like in the next 10 months, 5 months, or 4 months. So I want to show my true colors. But I have some ideas that you might like to think about. Suppose I am your physician and you are not an individual but the globe. And I want to take a look at your vital signs. And I would go back in history, and I go back to 1918 to 1920 Spanish flu, which is really quite fascinating and really has not been studied enough, because following it by 1922-23, the United States embarked on the greatest economic boom in its history, which has been lost, unfortunately. And what's interesting, nobody has really answered why the Spanish flu disappeared. There are theories and so forth, herd immunity possibly, but there's no definitive issue. I make that because I think that we don't learn from the past, and quite frankly, we were entirely ignorant of the Spanish flu when the current pandemic hit. I've argued, of course, about massive attacks of disruption, and so the vital signs I'm going to use to think about the future are how the vital signs may track over the next 10 months, year, 2 years, in terms of the 7 major disruptors that I describe in massive attacks of disruption, which in essence is a hedgehog, not a porcupine, not a hedgehog, unless you're living in Northern Europe where porcupines are called hedgehogs. The first of the disruptors was failed and failing government. And as we are observing today in Romania, that malaise has not gone away. And so I think in many areas, failed and failing government is likely to get worse, and I don't think it's going to improve in most places. And that includes Russia and China, by the way, because often we forget that China and Russia have huge weaknesses, which we tend to ignore, because certainly in the United States, we focus too much on the nature of the threat, which we often exaggerate, as we understood during much of the Cold War when we exaggerated Soviet capability, and certainly in 2003 when we made the ill-advised assault on Iraq. Second, climate change. I cannot be optimistic on climate change getting any better. Look at New York City. 50 people died when their basement flats were flooded. A storm in 150 years dropped 3 inches of water on Central Park. in the space of a couple of hours. So I don't see climate change getting better. I see storms intensifying. I see forest fires raging. I see drought in some areas continuing. And I don't see we're going to make any particular efforts to make a big difference. And in any event, it's going to take decades. Third, cyber. I don't think the Russians or the nominal 10-year-old kid someplace are going to cease cyber operations. There's too much money in it. And so I think that cyber disruption is going to continue. And indeed, the cyber offense, unlike what Clausewitz said, is probably 3-to-1 over the defense. So cyber becomes an increasingly difficult and complicated problem. Social media. Social media, as you know, has extraordinary potential for good or for ill. The Tahrir Square riots in Egypt were summoned over social media in the matter of a few minutes. And social media is going to become increasingly more powerful politically as governments continue to fail or at least not be able to perform the basic functions that are required for society. Terror. I'm less worried about the Islamic State terrorists because, you know, we've had 20 years to put defenses in place, and I think we've become very good. I am really worried about right-wing white supremacists in the United States, in a country where we have far more guns than we have people, and where violence is breaking out on a much more regular basis in terms of shootings, and even on airlines, where booze is no longer allowed to be served for fear of causing a riot. Debt. If the Congress passes and the President signs the approximately $5 trillion to pay for the new infrastructure bill and the jobs bill, U.S. national debt will be reaching something on the order of $30 or $35 trillion, which is perhaps 150% over our GDP. And with interest rates equivalently at 0 or 1%, that's fine. But what happens when interest rates reach 3%, 5%, or during the 1970s above 10%? It's going to choke everything off, and I think debt, even though we seem to ignore it today, the stock market is booming at unprecedented levels, that could be the ticking time bomb that really undoes us. Drones. I think that drones are the next major disruptor. They are not regulated, even though the FAA, the Federal Aviation Agency, is trying to do something with them. You can manufacture them in your basement. They are extremely intelligent. My wife's son-in-law lives in McLean on a farm and has a 4-year-old drone which he bought from DJI, which is the biggest drone manufacturer in China, which responds to hand signals. So you can fly it like this. It's 4 years old. Think about the technology. And as I posited in my book, The Fifth Horseman, imagine if the January 6 rioters came not wearing these extraordinary helmets and sticks and baseball bats, but at 100 or 200 drones, each with a stick of dynamite. How destructive they will be. And so even in what would seem more passive uses where drones are being used for surveillance, this is an area which is going to be hugely disruptive, and I don't see controls getting any better. And so my forecast for the future is that it's not going to be more of the same. It's going to be different, but in ways it's going to be different, it's going to be more disruptive. Now, will this lead to huge instabilities? Will this lead to all sorts of other disruptions that have larger political effects? I don't think so. I think they will contribute to a general diminution of the standard of living for most people, especially in the United States, which is going to cause a readjustment. But I also think that Adam Smith was right. After the Battle of Saratoga, the fall of 1777, when Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne was defeated, a student came up to Adam Smith, who was a professor at the University of Edinburgh, and said, "Professor Smith, it's horrible, we are ruined. Burgoyne was defeated." And Smith said, "My boy, there's a lot of ruin in a nation." And so my sense is that our ability to absorb all sorts of disruptions may be enough to be able to buffet and contain the larger effects. But by no means is that certain. The last point I'd make before I stop, Professor Powell said that the challenge between the United States and China in particular is based on economics and other rivalries. I don't think so. What worries me about the Biden administration, and this has been part of America's obsession with culture, crusade, and partisanship, that we put this on an ideological basis. That if you read what Joe Biden has said, what his Secretary of State has said, what his National Security Advisor has said, this is an ideological rivalry in which democracy and liberalism must take on authoritarianism. Well, we've heard that song before. We've heard that in Vietnam, and that didn't work very well. We heard that in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we heard that during the Cold War, when in fact it got us in lots of trouble. So my concern is that we are pursuing far too much of an adversarial relationship with both China and Russia. Not that they're not out to do us damage, but the way we're approaching it, in my mind, is too much from a position of using force and not sufficiently using our brains. And I'm afraid that we could provoke all sorts of unhappy consequences because the challenge and competition should not be on the basis of ideology. It should be on the basis of competing interest and shared interest. It should be made on the basis of engagement. And what concerns me in both cases, we're not engaging. In the example of Russia, the United States desperately needs to have an arms control agreement. Why? Because Russia has modernized its nuclear forces. We now have B-52 bombers that are probably older than anybody in the room except me. We have to refurbish our so-called triad of sea, air, and land systems, which we cannot afford. And one of the reasons we can't afford it, in terms of our defense budget, which is already $750 billion a year, is that traditionally nuclear weapons cost about 4%. But given the increase of costs, when you have the B-21 bomber that's going to cost even more than an F-35, cost of nuclear weapons is going to be around 8 or even 9% of the budget. Where's that money going to come from? Where's that money going to come from? So I would argue that there may be a little bit more stability if Adam Smith is correct. But unless we keep our eye on these disruptors, these vital signs that I have mentioned, and make sure that we can try and constrain and limit damage, a term from the Cold War, any of these things could be explosive in a very, very negative way, in the form of some other type of September 11th that becomes a shock to the system, something we should have known about, didn't anticipate, because as long as governments continue to fail and be failing, it's very, very difficult to do any kind of long-range planning, which is essential. So my weather forecast is not going to be sunny. It's not necessarily going to be stormy, but it might be somewhere in between. And I know that's a very, very weak answer, but all I can tell you is we need to take a look at these potential disruptors to understand where we're headed and do what we can, as I said, to absorb a lot of ruin in a nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ullman. I'm afraid I wouldn't say that it is very encouraging to listen to your forecast, but I guess it is much better to think realistically about what can happen than to dream about things that would never happen.
John Keynes' notion, John Maynard Keynes' notion, after all, we're dead.
That's right, right. All right. Some of these disruptors that you mentioned, sir, I think are very true for our particular part of the world. And if I'm not mistaken, Madam Ambassador Poptodorova has a couple of ideas about this region that are actually also that make the key topic of the whole forum. Ambassador Poptodorova, dobry wieczór, and we are ready to listen to you. You have the virtual floor, madam.
Just a minute. Am I unmuted? I'm unmuted? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, sir. It's indeed daunting to be in the company of so many stellar analysts and speakers. And while listening to everybody until now, and I know the same will follow after me, I was thinking that I will actually ring kind of dissonant with what has been said until now. probably later on. I may even sound old-fashioned or parochial, but it is true. Thank you for kind of opening the door a little bit to me. I do intend to talk about home, about our own region. Thinking about it and thinking about the title of the panel, which is so well found, it's so well worded, I have to say that to me, it's a much broader title than the words in it actually suggest. I think that the post-pandemic world is actually they may be sort of conclusion, but not closing the chapter, concluding a period and moving into a next one, into a next phase. So when I try to discuss a post-pandemic world, it will contain more occurrences, more crises that we went through even before the pandemic struck. And yes, indeed, beginning with international security, and this is what I've been doing in my professional life, I'm afraid we do need this, the brackets, or maybe take them off, in security. Another concept which I loved, and it's not only a concept, it's actually a practical consequence, is the asymmetrical impact. And I will also allude to it, although maybe in a rather unexpected manner. So Destiny wanted me to go through all different stages of our region's struggle to extricate itself from the bipolar security arrangements of the Cold War into a new international and regional security, not insecurity system. And that's why we are consciously and subconsciously eager to talk about security. And that has been going on for the past 30 years, ever since the early 90s of the past century. We lived through the happy 90s when everything was possible. And the countries of Central and Eastern Europe could reach a long-cherished dream and goal, of course, a practical goal of joining the rest of the democratic world in every possible sense. It was supposed to be both civic, economic, cultural, security alignment in the transatlantic partnership. I have to utter a warning here. I have to say that I am a strongly convinced European, very much European, but also very much a transatlanticist. So please bear with me when I will always try to argue in favor of a transatlantic partnership in the future as well, despite all odds. It was actually one dimension of globalization as seen at the turn of the century. And again, here, take it as you will, I wouldn't be the one to tomb over globalization. Yes, it will change. It will probably be dramatically different and uncozy from what we've known it to be or expected it to be. But it will continue. But we simply need to adjust to a new kind of multilateral arrangements and relations. And yes, it will be a globalization again, only probably in a different manner. And maybe we shall be changing the vocabulary a bit, which wouldn't change very much the substance and the essence. While we are not, I'm talking about, of course, my country, but with all due respect, that applies also to probably to the region as a whole. We have not even completed the third industrial revolution of digitalization when we have already to cope with the fourth industrial revolution. And that's an uphill battle, which we've not yet even fully realized and appreciated. The past years, and I'm again referring to the happy years, were also marked by the Euro-Atlantic consensus on both memberships, the European Union and NATO, which gave us a vision. It gave us the goal for the future. I'm afraid one of the domestic issues my country, Bulgaria, is facing, maybe others as well, is that while wrongly taking memberships as a goal, as a national goal, we are now looking desperately, frantically around to find the new goal. And that results kind of fight back into domestic clashes and political struggle, which unfortunately does not produce any even midterm vision or midterm strategy. But then things radically changed, and all of us, we went through a lot. Old Europe, New Europe, it didn't matter anymore because we were all in the financial crisis, the migration crisis. Yes, the annexation of Crimea, which was truly the turning point, but Brexit as well. And finally, on top of all the pandemic happened. So when I said that it's a post-pandemic world of more than just pandemic effect, I really refer to every single crisis which we managed to handle differently, in very different ways, each individual country, but still we went over. However, those were issues which were not fully resolved. We haven't found the golden key to kind of believing these crises to be forever over. So, as I say, we are actually at the same time now dealing with a totally new environment, with this advancing forth the industrial revolution, as I think President Biden referred to it very forcefully, very explicitly in his speech, probably the first one, at the beginning of his office. And yes, indeed, it's daunting. It's artificial intelligence, it's the Internet of Things, it's cloud computing, it's cognitive computing, and that in the midst of a raging global pandemic and lockdowns and deep unhappiness by the businesses and closing down of small and medium-sized businesses, economic challenges. So all of this is a post-pandemic world, which does not only refer to health itself. In this extremely complicated environment, I think that task and challenge number one is preserving the democratic order. And one of the previous speakers did refer to the big danger to preserve democratic order over growing attempts to bring in autocratic governance, presented to the public as a panacea to the new threats and risks. And believe me, in my country, this is a rising risk, domestic political risk, which at this point in time, at least, has not found its response, its adequate response. Again, I think we should start from home, from the situation in our own region, if we want to secure broader, more far-reaching results and actually security guarantees. I think we need to look at security in a broader, but also in a stricter, narrower sense. Security as defense and military security. Actually, the problem is that recent years have brought about democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe, even more so in South and Eastern Europe itself, in our region. And it comes in part from more vocal groups expressing resentment at having to master somehow and install institutions and values of the West. So this has led to growing insecurity because of the failures to replicate the Western model, and actually its own incompatibility with the realities on the ground. Another factor occurred. The region, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been used over all these years to the transatlantic community operating in kind of sync, synchronously. And this all changed abruptly when during President Trump's administration in the US, there was a clear divergence in approaches and policy to the region. And this is a vulnerable region. It has not yet built its solid foundation, which can carry us through that kind of political experiences, which may bring more risks, outside risks, so to say. And that actually induced a split into nominatively pro-Western and pro-EU camps, and increasing domestic polarization on geopolitical issues and solutions. And believe me, that is not the case in, as I'm sorry, I'll be referring to old Europe and Europe in a kind of a good-natured, good-humored fashion. But you don't know about that. But this can be a dominant. This can actually influence and impact solutions and decisions, political decisions in other areas, in the economy, defense, of course, security, social matters even. So a one-sided approach to the recently launched concept of EU strategic autonomy, and I listened very carefully to the options, three options about the EU in the future, which were all rather soberly praised. But that one-sided approach to EU strategic autonomy, I'm afraid, may create a distorted assessment of the new threats and risks, as well as of the ways in handling them. It is no wonder, therefore, that there is a distinct desire in our region for more U.S. cooperation and involvement in the regional process of security building and economic development. It again goes back to the lack of this more solid foundation. And countries differ in the region from one to the other. I think that our host country, Romania, is in a much better position, in a much better place than other countries in the region in terms of its own clear domestic assessment, domestic appreciation of strategic goals and interests. There is another growing frustration across the region, and the name is corruption. I know how base, how low, how kind of unlofty it may sound. We're discussing strategic autonomy of the European Union. We're discussing the big trends of the world today, and there comes corruption, which is supposed to go with the weaker, with feebler societies that cannot yet at least create this framework of checks and balances, which will check people in power and in any way corruption at all levels. As different as the national settings may be, the concerns about corrupt elites are shared and mutual. And again, forgive me, I'm always making references to my own country. You may know that there was a special decree, special decision by the US administration to apply the Magnitsky law to some individuals in my country. It happened also to another country in the region. But as I say, as different as the national settings may be, that these concerns are seen as more effectively handled and fought with the help of the United States. As I said, I'm very much European, and at times I'm frustrated and I'm unhappy with the a slow and inefficient process in the European Union itself. I'm using now this single problem, corruption, to mention it, but it may also go to other areas as well. So this has given rise in a populist discourse that this populist discourse, which is anti-Western, anti-American, and increasingly frames the domestic interests as being counter, as being totally opposite to the Euro-Atlantic agenda. And I believe that this is a risk, this is a danger with a kind of a long effect, a long damaging effect. I think both NATO and the EU must deal with it. Being conscious of the fact that Russia's goal, and yes, in this neighborhood, Black Sea, we have to mention Russia inevitably. The goal of the Kremlin is to advertise the failure of the Western model and to discredit NATO expansion and EU integration as pillars for democracy and stability in the Balkans. I warned you that I may ring old-fashioned and maybe too local, too parochial, but this is our daily agenda, and it needs to be well known to the bigger world, to the bigger transatlantic world. Actually,
thank you, Madam.
Region,
I'm afraid I will have to be very impolite, and I do apologize. I'm afraid
that's okay.
I'm afraid our time is running faster, just like the crisis at the global level. You know, they come quicker and quicker. So we thank you very much for your contribution. We'll move on. And since you mentioned several times the transatlantic relationship, I'm pleased now to turn to George Friedman and ask him to share with us some of his thoughts on this topic. Mr. Friedman, we are all ears.
It must be uncomfortable. Let me first thank you for having me. And thank you for having me speak on the subject on which the United States has been obsessed the past few days, Afghanistan. And it's necessary to put Afghanistan in a historical context. And the personal context was that in 1975, I was in Paris, and our troops had just been withdrawn from Afghanistan. I'm from Vietnam. We were in the middle of the Watergate crisis, and it would look like the government was falling apart. And the French, with German Schadenfreude, were delighted to tell me that America was finished, that it was no longer trustworthy, no further reliable. Well, of course, they were wrong. We went on to another 20 years and then did it again. So the two questions is, why do we keep doing it again? And why do the Europeans always think that now it's over, the American age? So let's talk about why we do it over and over again. Since World War II, we've had three selective wars: Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Neither were fundamental to the American interest. None of them ended satisfactorily. Korea most satisfactory, but still not what we wanted. And we live with the conclusion. But we went into the wars and carried them out. The end of the war ended always in political instability. Harry Truman was the least popular president the United States had ever had when he left office. He's now worshipped by many Americans. We had the Watergate crisis as we left Vietnam. And of course, we had the Trump-Biden crisis, and now Biden is in trouble. This is a model by which the United States works its process. But we have to remember two things about the United States. The first is that it's an overwhelmingly powerful nation in the world. It is the largest economic power. It is the largest importer of goods in the world, and therefore has influence on the countries that sell to them. It is the largest investor in the world. And obviously its military, I won't go through it all, is substantial. And that means that a country configured like this can make mistakes. The mistakes are unpleasant beyond belief to the victim countries in which we operated, many of whom hoped we'd win and were deeply shattered when we didn't, and unsettling to our allies who expect miracles from the United States. I say that not bitterly, they do. Going back to World War II, they were committed, and when we don't live up to World War II, we're suspected. So we have to understand American geopolitics. The first thing is that the United States lives on the North American continent and cannot be attacked by land. To the north is Canada, to the south is Mexico. The total GDP of North America is a little larger than the total GDP of the EU. So we live in a prosperous place and a militarily secure place from ground attack. Our dangers come from the Atlantic and the Pacific, which we control. The US Navy is overwhelmingly powerful. And any challenge that we see to ourselves in either ocean, we react to. One of the great fears of the United States, if not to the Europeans, was that the Soviets would use their submarines to block access to Europe in the event of war. And the United States saw them as a south of what was called the Geo Gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, a serious military power, and responded accordingly. When we go into the Pacific, our relationship to the Pacific has to do with Pearl Harbor. It has to do with the Japanese. It has to do with the real possibility the Japanese had of controlling the Pacific, and if they've controlled the Pacific, actually presenting a threat to the United States. It's in this context that you have to see our relationship to China. It began as a trade issue. The question of whether or not the United States would have access to Chinese markets on the same basis China had access to the United States. China could not give this. It was too economically fragile to allow American competition to undermine their companies. It refused to give it. Instead, it responded by challenging the right, which was in the international law unchallengeable, of foreign ships, particularly American ships, to operate in the South China Sea. China spoke a great deal, did very little. The United States was not going to give up. But it was the oceans that mattered to the United States. Now, if you go into the Pentagon, the Army will say no. And if you go to think tanks in the United States, they won't think this way. This is my thinking. So long as the oceans are in American, and Canada and Mexico are not occupied by a foreign power, we are invulnerable. But nations that are invulnerable confuse that with being omnipotent. Nations that are secure look for the possibilities of threats. And that's what the United States did. The United States looked for the possibility of a threat arising out of the Korean Peninsula being in Russian hands. Now, this was a far-fetched fear. It was real. We went in. The Vietnam War was built more around the word credibility than anything else. American strategy in Europe depended on the assumption that the United States would be willing to fight, even use nuclear weapons, to protect the Europeans. The Europeans reasonably asked the question, would they really do it? And the Russians made it very clear that this was a question. Our fear was that if we didn't do it, well, if we didn't do it, then what happens? Will Charles de Gaulle be able to persuade Germany to move away from the United States and into an entente with the French. All these were thoughts that were thought in heated passion by a country that didn't have other problems to worry about. The war in Afghanistan started 40 years ago, not 20 years ago. It started with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the creation of an American, Saudi Arabian, and Pakistani group designed to recruit jihadists, train them in Pakistan, and the United States would finance them and provide weapons. And very heavy weapons provided, Stinger missiles, and so on. That war ended when the Soviets withdrew, just before the Soviet Union collapsed, a couple of years before the Soviet Union collapsed, and this war was in that sense successful. Now, how critical was it to the United States? Did it really matter to the United States if the Soviets moved in Afghanistan? Not clearly, but given the hierarchy of interests the United States had, obviously some effort should be made. 9/11 killed 3,000 Americans, and we did not know how many more would be killed. Retrospectively, everybody knows the size of the threat. Prospectively, it was unclear that Al-Qaeda was simply one cell operating in the United States and not a highly systematic operation designed to upset the rest of the world. We also knew that Al-Qaeda was being managed by Mullah Omar, that he was given sanctuary, and that many of those given sanctuary had been trained by the Americans. There was great irony and unpleasantness in this. We went into Afghanistan primarily to raid the country to get rid of Osama bin Laden. And some of the same people who had operated in what was called Operation Cyclone went back to their old friends with bundles of money and asked, where is he and where is he going? Well, we found out where he is, and he escaped to Tora Bora. Now, the question was, our primary mission was not an invasion, but a raid. What do we do now? There were two options. Leave. We didn't get him. We'll go hunt for him somewhere else. Or stay. The political pressure to do something was overwhelming. Europeans, I've noticed occasionally have this pressure too, but Americans have it intensely. The idea that we would let 3,000 dead lie because we failed to capture them, capture Osama bin Laden, was not there. So a mission creep took place. We were no longer hunting for Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. We were trying to make sure that terrorists wouldn't operate from there. We were trying to make sure that terrorism wouldn't be a base for terrorism. Now, that is an absurd goal. How terrorists can exist in the next town you live in. Terrorists don't need the base. That's their entire strength. But more to the point, we could not possibly conquer Afghanistan. That was not possible. But in Vietnam, it was easier to stay than to leave. In Korea, it was easier to stay than to leave. And Afghanistan, because of 9/11, it was overwhelmingly easier to stay than to leave. Because we see the political repercussions of the end, but the political repercussions of being passive would have been enormous. We're a democratic society, and that society was demanding something. So when I look at the events in Afghanistan, I look at them in terms of America in the post-Cold War world, in the post-war world. In the post-World War world, we had learned that not acting promptly, not standing with the Europeans, not insisting on Czechoslovakia not being given up, on Munich not happening, cost us tremendously. We were a young country. We are still a young country, and we take our bearings from what we learned from World War II. We would not accept the loss of South Korea. We would not allow a Vietnamese government to take place. We would not allow the Islamists to control to control Afghanistan. We were obsessed with the lessons of World War II and still are. That if we do not act promptly and decisively, what comes later is horrible. Now, what comes later is really bad. We should point out that as dramatic as Taliban made that withdrawal appear, it was a deliberate, careful plan by Taliban. They did not want us to leave. They want us to be defeated. And if they could not defeat us, they would show defeat. However we timed it, however days we put into it, however we did it, they were going to disrupt it. And because they had excellent intelligence, they had excellent weapons, mostly taken from us, speaking of corruption, they were going to be able to do this. And they achieved precisely what they wanted. They wanted the Americans to look impotent. They wanted themselves to look enormously powerful. And just as the Vietnamese wanted to do the same thing, and the North Koreans, if they could have, they achieved it. Now, the question is, how do we go forward? First, every American intervention in Eurasia has been unfortunate. The only one that worked was in Europe, when the Soviets were too prudent to intervene. Nuclear weapons were dangerous. The United States had allies, and we could stand there and nothing happened. We didn't learn from that. We learned from that we had to act quickly and immediately and overwhelmingly in order to stabilize the situation. The world now consists of 4 centers. One is China, one is Russia, one is the United States, and one is Europe. I think the Americans and the Chinese have come to understand themselves very well, each other very well, in the same way that the Russians and the Americans wound up in the Cold War understanding each other pretty well. The principle was everybody goes home and sleeps in their bed, and there were rules and communications and lines. And I think that the Chinese-American confrontation is less dangerous by the day. I could be wrong, but the Chinese cannot attack because they might lose. And if they lost, their internal political situation would be unacceptable. The United States can't possibly attack China. Landing in China would be catastrophic. So these are 2 countries that will, I suspect, negotiate it. The mystery of the world is Europe. Europe is one of the most wealthy areas of the world. But as Zbigniew Brzezinski said, who do I call if I want to talk to Europe? There is no center of gravity that we can talk to. The European, our NATO allies, did send troops. They were tokens, fair enough, but they did not bear the burdens and did not bear the risks. The Europeans are very careful at managing their risks. So the United States, in an alliance where the alliance worked, might have responded differently to Afghanistan. One of the advantages of an alliance that's working is the people on both sides take risks together, significant risks, and shape what happens. Same as, but that wasn't the case. So at this point in history, after Afghanistan, which I regard as a defining moment in American history, this is the point where we stop doing stupid things, or try to stop doing stupid things. But the question now is, what is our relationship to Europe? The Europeans have said they might have their own army because they don't trust the Americans. Fantastic. We urge you to have your own army. You have a GDP sufficient to have a military force as large as the Americans. You have a technical capability. You don't have a culture. 3 of my children served in the military. 23% of all Americans are veterans, and you count their families, over half the families are somehow involved with the military. Europe has no such culture. It's afraid of it because of what it done before, and that's understandable. But what do we cooperate in? What is the basis of our cooperation? So there's a necessary trade that goes on between us. There is a necessary friendship culture that goes on beyond us. I was born in Hungary and have a great deal of affection for Hungary. But what are the transactions that are taking place? What can we count on Europe for? And to me, the essential problem in all three wars, there was others there. There were Europeans there, but not enough to grab us by the neck and have the British say, hey, guy, we tried to do this in Afghanistan. We failed. You're not going to do any better. There is no balancing to a very young and very powerful country. And the only thing that comes out of these defeats in the war is everybody being certain we're finished. It's very hard to finish a country this powerful. And we are not fighting fundamentally important wars. So it would seem to me very rational if the Europeans could make decisions and act on them. I won't say that you're responsible for Afghanistan, you're not, nor to Vietnam or anything else. But you are responsible for not balancing the international system. And the primary export of Europe is blame, as an American saying. So what I would ask the Europeans to do is to sit down, think about Afghanistan, think about the next war, think about how it will be fought. It will not be fought as you imagine it, with the Russians rushing the borders. This is not what's going to happen. We need the Europeans to bring, I won't call it wisdom, but weapons that they use prudently to the battlefield. And it's time for the EU to decide what it is, and for us to decide, is our only meaningful European relationship with the United Kingdom? Is there a general relationship with Europe? What will they give us in return that we need? And so I think the imbalance of the international system is the fact that Europe has not defined itself and has not acted on that definition. And I don't mean to be critical, but I'm very cranky about the Afghan war and feel very bad about it.
Thank you very much. Indeed, a lot of things to think about and perhaps disagree about, to say nothing about agreeing on. So we move from the United States, because I think you are in the United States right now. We come back to Romania and invite Ambassador Teodor Meleșcanu to briefly share with us his thoughts, and then we'll jump to the UK with our colleague, with Professor Cocker, to wrap it up. Thank you very much again, Mr. Friedman. Ambassador Meleșcanu, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to tell you that I prepared an excellent presentation for today, but there are two problems. The first one is that my presentation is in Romanian. You'll have a lot of difficulties. And secondly, the fact that there is no time to deliver all the issues. I'm really impressed by the important number of participants, and I hope very much that they will survive to our discussions finally. Now, let me say, câte minute? 5 minute? 5?
Not more than 5.
5 minute, okay. As I said, in 5 minutes I can speak about everything, but that's not the main objective. Okay, the first item, it's the problem of the pandemic problem. We have to recognize honestly that the technology and the necessary monies can bring for almost every country to prepare viruses. Okay, this is not the best use. It does not mean that we will overcome this period. It can appear every year or every day in a place or another. That's why I will say very honestly, I think the top priority is to try to understand and increasing the capabilities of the public health systems in our countries and in other countries. Secondly, I want to underline also the fact that the borders of the countries cannot stop the viruses. That's why there is a need for working together in order to fight the pandemics and the consequences. I would like to say that, unfortunately, at the level of the European Union, the health system is not part and parcel of the acquis communautaire. It's for every country. I mean, everybody, every national country will have to adopt the necessary measures. The third one is that we need a much more efficient organization at the international level. I'm speaking about the WHO, which is the International World Health Organization, because unfortunately some of the conclusions they have presented created more problems than results. I would like to make a bridge. Yes, there is a bridge between pandemics and security. You'll ask me why. It's very simple. Because the money you have put into the health system will be taken from the security field. That's why we need a certain balance between the efforts for combating pandemics and also for assuring the armed forces to defend our security. Now, I will try to give you some ideas to think about. My main problem as a person, it's not an official position of my country, but I am free now. I am a professor. I mean, I have nothing. I mean, can say whatever I want. The key issue is to arrive at a refurbishing point of the notion of international public law. Why do I say that? Not because the international law is obsolete, but contrary, we need, nevertheless, to improve and to bring the international law at the level of what is happening in the world. Why do I say that? There is a clear evolution. Everybody is trying to stay under Article 5 from the NATO, from the Washington Convention. Everybody knows very well that as long as you are not getting out, you can be practically attacked by the NATO organization as a whole. That's why, as I say, we need a clear definition of the war, be it hybrid war, conventional war, nuclear war, and others. If we are not doing that, it's obviously we'll continue to use different issues. I'm giving a very simple, I cannot speak about everything. One of the clear examples is the Black Sea. If you look at the Black Sea, you will realize that, of course, the eastern border is very important, but at the same time, we have to understand that there is a very clear effort on behalf of the Russian Federation to refurbish the borders of the Eastern European countries, which from my point of view is really very dangerous. If we speak about the Crimea, we can speak about Ukraine, we can speak about Moldova, we can speak about Georgia, and so on and so forth. As long as we do not concentrate on a definition accepted by everybody, we'll continue to have a lot of problems. Why? Because sometimes, even at the level of the Security Council of the United Nations, there were no possibilities to adopt measures. And finally, to have something, we created a so-called coalition of willing. It's not a decision of the Security Council. It's a coalition of willing. That's why we have to put it in the international law. What I can also say is that today, if you look at what is happening in our region, Black Sea, from all points of view, is one of the key issues, topics for security in the eastern border between NATO, European Union, and the Russian Federation. If you look at it, you will see that all the countries, parts and parcels of the former Russian Federation, are occupied in some regions by different armies. It's not official armies, but voluntary freedom fighters and others. The same is true for Ukraine. I don't even speak about the illegal annexation of Crimea. In Georgia, you have Ossetia and Abkhazia. In Moldova, in Transnistria, over the Dniester, it's there. And all these issues are practically the instruments which can be used by the Russian Federation from this point of view. Now, finally, when we speak about all these definitions, I think we have to introduce, or to accept at least, the notion of hybrid war. We can speak about hybrid war, but nobody says what is really the hybrid war. Hybrid war means a lot of things, including cyber attacks or offensives, social media, fake news, high resilience, and other problems. We have to produce it. We have also to adopt the fact that there is a necessity for having a very clear definition also for terrorism. The United Nations adopted a number of 19 conventions and agreements on terrorism, but no one offered a definition of what is terrorism, because the terrorism can cover a lot of issues. That's why, as I said, we need to make an effort in order to create and to develop the international law. And it's not like it's happening now. The international law exists, but different countries have a different readings when they look at the international law. That's why I think this is our top priority. Okay, I had a lot of very exceptional ideas, but my time is running out. Thank you very much.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, sir. Indeed, exceptional solutions call for exceptional circumstances, call for exceptional measures. So the exceptional measures is that we had to shorten your time. And I hasten to move to Professor Cocker with the Ideas think tank of the London School of Economics as the latest and definitely not the least speaker of our meeting. Professor Cocker, we are ready for you, sir.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. We don't have very much time. Explanation for the circumstances in which we find ourselves, I think today, and particularly in the light of what has gone on in Afghanistan, which is a humiliation and is unfortunately likely to be a defining event in the next few years. And I would say it's because we haven't, for the last 20 years, thought about strategy. We have not thought strategically in the way that we did in the Cold War, which was a success because we got the strategy right. And I know the circumstances are different, but I just give you a few examples of that. President Obama saying, after yet another horrific episode in the Syrian civil war, when asked by the press corps whether he had a strategy, was honest enough to say we don't, and then came back a week later with what he called a game plan, for which he was criticized by his Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, in her memoirs, saying that game plans are not strategies, but her definition of a strategy was an organizing principle. And she didn't have a strategy for winning the 2016 election. She only had a slogan, make America, stronger together. And Trump, as we know, had a more appealing slogan for a large part of the electorate, make America stronger. Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his very last op-ed piece for the New York Times before he died, said that it was a wonderful bumper sticker, but it wasn't a strategy. So I'll just give you a few cases of how we've kind of gone out of the grand strategic vision that people like Brzezinski and Kissinger, whether you agreed with him or not, legitimate disagreements, of course, can be had, but at least they brought a strategic perception to dealing with the Soviet Union. And it's 30 years now since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think we should go back and revisit some of those lessons. The lessons, I think, are first, don't overreach. It was a lesson that Robert Gates, after he stood down as Defense Secretary, tried to communicate in a very extensive interview he gave with the Wall Street Journal. He said, we lost the plot in Syria. We insisted that Assad must go without having a clue how to make that possible. In fact, there was only one country that could have made it possible, and that was Russia. It ended up with the United States identifying a very weak and divided rebel force to whom it shipped arms, and even more absurdly with the CIA at one point supporting an Al-Qaeda affiliated group because it was considered to be less extreme than some of the other so-called pro-Western groups. I think the second lesson is be very realistic about what you can and can't do. Afghanistan, of course, contrary to what President Biden said in his speech a week or so ago, was nation building as well as regime change. Didn't start like that, didn't have to end like that, but that was the reality. And you're dealing with a country in which, according to the World Economic Forum, had the worst record on women's rights 10 years before Taliban came to power, and which today, according to a Georgetown gender study, has the second worst record on women's rights after Yemen, after 20 years of effectively Western occupation. The second point, I think, that we should learn from what's gone wrong in order to try to tackle problems in the future is don't box yourself in by storytelling. And the United States, unfortunately, told itself a whole series of stories that were frankly unbelievable. One was Dick Cheney when he was Defense Secretary back in 1992, with the end of the Cold War, saying we have so much strategic depth that we have difficulty defining the national interest. That's what he said. There should be no difficulty defining national interest. And even the concept of strategic depth, given the fact that there are other players around, such as China that was rising and Russia that was declining but was likely to come back into the picture at some point. Superpowers and great powers do not have the privilege of strategic depth. They have enemies, and they have people who want to change and to challenge the system that they're trying to manage. And then, of course, there was President Clinton's strategic pause. We have so much time now that the Soviet Union has gone that we don't even really need a defense policy. Or George Bush's NSC report, 2001, I think it was May 2001, that Russia was going to be out of the picture for 15 years because it couldn't cope with globalization, whatever that phrase actually meant. So I think it's very important not to tell ourselves these extraordinary tales that just are not convincing, any more, of course, than the most extraordinary tale of all, that China was going to become a nice democracy, thanks, of course, to the imperatives of globalization. Another point is that we've taken our eye off the ball by constantly being preoccupied with one threat at a time. And after 9/11, it was just the global war on terror, and there was no other narrative. And as has been pointed out very well by David Kilcullen, quoting James Woolsey during his hearings for CIA nomination back in 1993, there are two enemies out there, dragons and snakes. And the dragons were China and Russia, who are now back in the picture. We now confront, I think, the real possibility of another great power conflict, possibly a war with both countries. That's anyway a challenge that we have to face in the next 20 years. And of course, there are the snakes remain in a variety of forms, not all of them Islamic fundamentalist. And the last point I'd make, because time is short, is to go back to Hans Morgenthal's very important perception, which is part of getting the strategy of containment and deterrence right in the Cold War, which is to have, and I quote him, a respectful understanding of the other side, what he calls strategic empathy, the ability to see how the other side sees the world, and indeed how the other side sees you. And that has been noticeably absent. And in fact, H.R. McMaster, in a recent book, criticized the administration he served, but also, I think, previous administrations as well, for what he called strategic narcissism, just seeing the world through one's own eyes and not through the eyes of others. Unless we understand what motivates Russian behavior, unless we understand what animates the Chinese, we are going to find ourselves in difficulties. So that's the only takeaway. If this was a business convention and you were paying an inordinate amount of money for the privilege of hearing speakers, you take takeaways with you. This would only be my takeaway. But I want to end by saying that although this has been very critical of the United States, I am very critical. It's a Western problem. It's not an American problem. The Europeans have been absent in this as well. The famous paper, if you remember, the first strategy paper the EU ever produced in 2003. Europe has never been safer, was the opening statement. We are privileged to live in these times. The next strategy paper in 2016 opens with the words, "We're living in a period of existential crisis." How come? What happened between 2003 and 2016? The neighborhood is the most dangerous neighborhood in the world. Yes, the United States is privileged to live in the safest neighborhood in the world. Europe lives in the most dangerous neighborhood in the world, and those dangers that are going to continue. And finally, I would say, if you want an explanation for the financial crisis, which almost undid us in 2008, 2007 and 2008, it's because the economists and the bankers didn't do strategy either. If you'd been at the London Business School in 2004, you would have been encouraged to take a course, because it was considered to be a great success story, on the Royal Bank of Scotland, that subsequently became the largest bank in the world and came within 24 hours of collapse in 2008. And the title of this course was The Royal Bank of Scotland, the Strategy of Not Having a Strategy. Because strategies were considered to tie you down. Strategies were time-consuming. Strategies didn't allow you to make easy, quick money. Well, they did allow you, of course, to make sound investments. So that's the takeaway. We have to learn from the problems and challenges that we've been facing in the last 30 years and start to think strategically again. Otherwise, we're going to be in real trouble.
Thank you very much, Professor. In guise of wrapping up, I would hang on to a remark you made about a Europe who lives in the most dangerous neighborhood. Well, let me just think that Romania is on the border of that neighborhood, which makes us consider security and not insecurity indeed one of the key elements. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the panel and of the audience, I thank you indeed for your patience and for your understanding, because this would be the end of this panel. In around 10 minutes, the next panel will start, so don't go away, because the next panel is equally exciting. Thank you very much indeed.